Hello. I think I'm live, so hello everyone. I just wanted to say I assume everything's going fine, and someone will jump in and tell me if it isn't. But hello. Thank you all for coming. We are here today for me to talk about my new book, Between Novel and Network, Technology and Literary Form in Fiction and Fan Fiction, published by Louisiana State University Press. So, my name is Suzanne Black. I am a researcher at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. My pronouns are she and her. This book is about the internet and 21st century fiction, but we'll get to that in a wee minute. First, I'd like to say a huge thank you to LSU Press for picking up this book, to Jenny Keegan, acquisitions editor, who's long been a supporter of fan studies, to Min Marcus for coordinating the production, and to James Wilson and Corey Calabria, for marketing and publicity, like organizing this live stream. Just to let you know, I cannot see the chat at all, but Corey from LSU Press is keeping an eye on it. So feel free to pop questions there as there will be time for a Q&A at the end. I also cannot see who is here. So if any of my friends are here, please feel free to message me afterwards so that you get your friend points for showing up. I am going to share some slides now. Hopefully you can see that. So I'd like to start with a bit about why I wrote this book. Then I will go on to describe the various elements that make up my research, because they're kind of lots of disparate parts. And then I'll end with a bit about how the chapters of the book work together. And hopefully by that point, you will know if it's something you want to read. So, since I was a teenager growing up in the 1990s, I have been enraptured by the idea of the internet, of cyberspace, of a digital realm beyond our physical one. In about 1996, I read the book Hackers by David Bischoff. Now, Hackers is not a literary classic. It is a novelization of the 1995 film of the same name, about a bunch of high school computer enthusiasts who do playful hacking until they are set up by real cyber criminals to take the fall for a terrorist cyber attack. While novelizations written from screenplays, as opposed to novels that are later adapted into film, are not typically prestigious. However, this one can be credited with the spark that led to my book. So Bischoff did his homework. He could have phoned this in and just done simple prose rendering of the film, but in between a retelling of the film's plot, he dropped intertextual references to some of the foundational texts in cyberpunk fiction. He mentioned William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, and Bruce Sterling, who wrote The Difference Engine. I tracked these down where I could, and I'm forever grateful to my local library for its esoteric collection. Reading these books sparked a lifelong interest in not just the mechanics and practical potential that lay in the internet and the wonderfully evocative idea of cyberspace, but also a deep interest in digital imaginaries. What would this new cyber realm look like? How would we interface with it? What narrative possibilities would it enable? So the 13-year-old me, who pored over that book, watched that film, and tracked down every intertext mentioned within them, could not have imagined how ingrained the computer network of the internet would become within her own lifetime. As Sherry Turkle puts it, quote, as connections to the internet went mobile, we no longer logged on from a desktop, tethered by cables to an object called a computer. The network was with us, on us all the time. So that's cyberspace and hackers. And there's another piece of the puzzle, which is fan fiction. So at the time I was reading Hackers, I had no idea that fan fiction existed, even though in the 1990s it was a popular pastime and a form of literature participated in by many people. So taking a definition of fan fiction as reworking elements from existing media properties without owning the copyright to those properties. I was definitely already doing that in English class without knowing it was called fan fiction. I went through my Little Women phase, and I'm sure some of you also went through a Little Women phase as teenagers as well. During that, I turned in writing assignments that were set in the United States in the 19th century, mimicked the writing style of Louisa May Alcott, and were on topics I had no experience in. One memorable short story was about the dangers of alcohol, and I advocated strongly for teetotalism. It wasn't until the year 2000 when we finally got the internet at home, and I found the television recap site Mighty Big TV, which became Television Without Pity, which had extensive forums, that I learned about something called fanfiction. So, in the same way that the internet symbolized to my teenage mind so much possibility, so did fanfiction. Here was a form of fiction created away from the strictures of publishers, producers, executives, and studios. Instead, anyone with a computer, an internet connection, and time on their hands could write stories that they wanted to read and share. My mind was blown. So that's kind of my origin story, but also that of the book. But what is the book actually about? So, the book is about how the 21st century digital literary sphere is characterized by networked literatures and how this is enabled by the networked communications technology of the internet. So, Simone Murray gives us the very useful phrase digital literary sphere, which she describes as, quote, the entire institutional apparatus governing the producing, disseminating, and consuming of literary culture. This extends to online readers' forums and authors' blogs, as well as digital media platforms such as Amazon, which have changed the way in which books are created, marketed, publicized, sold, reviewed, showcased, consumed, and commented upon. I am participating in the digital literary sphere here by talking to all of you on Facebook Live. So for Murray, quote, literary culture is, by the third decade of the 21st century, digital culture, leading to the impossibility of standing outside digital literary culture to analyze it when every website you visit or book you search changes the display and ranking of that content, since we are all already ineluctably part of the digital literary sphere. So Murray talks of books and digital media's complex contemporary coexistence, though her work is often focused on the books part. My work takes this a step further and talks about some more disparate parts of contemporary media and especially introduces fanfiction into the digital literary sphere. So Murray has made influential efforts to draw attention to the multiple connections between, quote, digital communications technologies and contemporary literary culture, but she stops short of admitting fanfiction. Instead, she judges that, quote, the absence of consensus around fanfiction's literary status necessarily marks it as beyond the scope of her book. But the sheer size of fanfiction, which has grown exponentially since the inception of digital fanfiction in the 1990s to become a massively popular form of literature, participated in so many readers and writers, forms a huge part of the contemporary literary landscape and should not be ignored. And I'm kind of glad she stopped because it left me space to write my book. So fanfiction, in my opinion, is an inherently valuable objective study, both for how it intersects with established literary forms and activities and for how it differs. And I argue that we have to include this prolific and non-commercial fan activity in any attempt to understand the entangled nature of the 21st century digital literary sphere. So the digital literary sphere, phrase is a bit of a mouthful, and indeed the whole 21st century mediascape is dominated by networks. Networks that are characterized by digitization, adaptation, and connection. So I wanted to introduce these three concepts before I draw on them a bit more. So digitization is facilitated by the internet as a meta medium, that is, a channel of delivery aggregating the previously separate channels of TV, cinema, radio, photograph, and book. J. David Bolter and Diane Gromola, they describe this situation as one in which, quote, the computer has now emerged as perhaps the most vigorous and eclectic remediator of all the various media that we still use, to borrow from, reconfigure, and remix all of the principal media of the 21st century. Everything on the internet is digital. So many of the paintings, famous paintings that I have seen in my life have been pixels on a screen. And I think it's important to remember that. So in terms of adaptation, As Graham Allen observes, it seems expected by media consumers that most films, music, television shows, and games, quote, are frequently, even predominantly, elusively based on previous decades and previous styles. And this remix culture can be seen in the popularity of transmedia franchises, where an established intellectual property is mined for every last bit of content. Think Disney's movies, theme parks, toys, and more. And Disney also owns Marvel and Lucasfilm, who each come with their own long lists of exploitable properties. And then in terms of connection, networks are made up of nodes and the connections between them. So thinking about the interconnections between different aspects of the digital literary sphere prompts us to ask how we define and understand those nodes and those connections. In my case, the nodes are media texts like novels, films, and fan fiction, and the connections are more difficult to untangle, which is partially the aim of my book. So one of my arguments is that if everything is text and everything is digital and everything is connected in the digital literary sphere, the question arises of how to make meaningful distinctions between discrete objects, such as between texts and intertexts, and between the nodes that comprise those networks, or even whether such distinctions can be made at all. So one way of exploring these media networks in the digital literary sphere is through using two concepts that I'm going to introduce in a second. One is theories of intertextuality, and the other is by looking at transmedia franchises, which I've already mentioned with Marvel and Disney. So, transmedia franchises first, that's the easier one. So these network literatures are characterized by being digital, by incorporating adaptation, and by being interconnected. An example of how this plays out is transmedia storytelling. Transmedia storytelling is defined by Henry Jenkins as constructing, quote, complex fictional worlds that are dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels. The Mandalorian TV show on Disney Plus and the Mandalorian Grogu film in cinemas, two different channels. For example, the sprawling transmedia universe of Marvel, which spans an 80-year history of comic books and films with a massive global reach, and the superheroes films of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel has used this transmedial reach to be at the top of the box office chart since 2008. Like other transmedia properties, for example, the Harry Potter and Star Wars franchises, Marvel's multiple media offerings allow it to both seem ubiquitous. I think most of us here have heard of Marvel Cinematic Universe films, even if you haven't seen one, and most of you have probably seen one. But it also allows it to fragment its audience and cater to them specifically in specific offerings. So Marvel, backed by Disney, seems like it's everywhere, or at least it does to me. Against this cultural pervasiveness, fanfiction, I argue, provides a literary space for alternative takes on the characters, worlds, and stories presented by Marvel. And despite its less visible status, it's not earning $1 billion at the box office, but there are currently over 635,000 works of fan fiction on the website Archive of Our Own that have been marked by their authors as relating to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think it's notable that the massive response of fan fiction, which is mostly textual, to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is audiovisual, reinforces the sort of importance of the written word within the current mediascape. And therefore, luckily for me with a background in literary studies, I argue that this means that methods developed in literary studies are well suited to navigate our textually informed era of networked connectivity. We're still reading and writing. So onto the intertextuality, which is going to be less familiar to some of you than Marvel films. So I think the most helpful theory from literary studies is intertextuality. Theories of intertextuality, as delineated by Roland Barthes, Julia Kristeva, and Jacques Derrida, they work to explain how texts relate to each other. So as Graham Allen says, Intertextuality seems such a useful term because it foregrounds notions of relationality, interconnectedness, and interdependence in modern cultural life. Theories of intertextuality talk about the ways in which all texts are connected. So a text can be written or any form of media, so a book or a movie or a um, blog post or a review of a book on Amazon or a bus ticket can all be texts. Yeah, so intertextuality says all texts are connected, where, quote, meaning becomes something which exists between a text and all other text to which it refers and relates, moving out from the independent text into a network of textual relations. So intertextuality is saying that we never read anything in isolation. We bring to the reading of that text everything that we have read before, um, and how we understand other texts to work as well. But if we think of all texts as being related to other texts, then how do we understand the limits or borders of edges of a single text in a network? That becomes problematized. So against the backdrop of the digital literary sphere, my work focuses specifically on several network literatures. And by this, I mean literature that consists of multiple interrelated texts that form systems of literature that are best understood as a whole rather than as separate parts, but are made up of separate parts. There's a tension there. So the texts I analyse consist of the already networked literatures of fanfiction and comic books, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The book also looks at transmedia franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, looks at epistolary fiction, which is fiction made up of letters or in the digital age, often emails and text messages, and romance novels. And I won't really have time to go into these today, unfortunately. And it opposes these forms of networked literature with the singular novel, which has often been positioned against networked literatures. So fan fiction is an emerging literary form that is less universally familiar, so I'll give a bit more of a definition of that. Comic books are pretty well known, so I'll just say a little bit about how they function as a network literature. And the novel is actually the trickiest one. It's a very familiar literary form. We all know what a novel is. We often conflate it with the physical object of a book. Um, it's so familiar to being to the point of being overdetermined. So I will outline some conventional understandings of the novel as a single discrete literary object, which is how people often end up referring to it. So fan fiction first. Although fan fiction has existed in many forms, with much scholarship locating its origins in the 1960s, with fans writing fiction in response to Star Trek, this book focuses on the proliferation of digital fan fiction in massive online archives since around 2010. And fan fiction, for my purposes, is a form of networked digital narrative that must be approached as digital, intertextual, and networked. It's also distinct from the commercial publishing industry. Fan fiction does not have to go through publishers to see the light of day, and fan fiction authors are usually not able to make money from their work. The delivery channel for most fan fiction in the early 21st century is massive digital archives like Archive of Our Own, which determine the ways in which the links between the works, writers, and readers are enabled or denied. Such archives aggregate works into one digital space and they promote an understanding of fan fiction that is necessarily plural rather than individualistic. So it's like an infinite book with many interlinked chapters. I cannot see my clock and I'm just a little bit worried about time, so I'm just going to reduce my slides for a second to double check where we are. Okay, about 20 minutes in. Thank you for that. Back to it. Okay. So that was fan fiction. As Sam Ford observes, why is it important? As Sam Ford observes, in an era where engagement with media content is more deeply ingrained in daily living than ever, a field dedicated to making sense of how people engage with and around media texts and use them as the fodder for meaning making, expression, and community building is more crucial than ever. So fan fiction offers us a way to see how audiences respond to media, sometimes in critical ways. So serialized superhero comic books provide an example of a network literature that functions as a parallel to the infinite book of digital fan fiction. Um, Marvel Comics and Detective Comics, or DC, are responsible for some of the most recognizable superheroes with long, tangled publishing histories. And in the universe of Marvel Comics, for example, narrative relations among titles were rapidly and increasingly interconnected as character arcs and larger plot elements sprawled from one title to another. So Marvel is credited as introducing the multiverse, where there are multiple parallel universes with different versions of characters in each one and how they can cross over. Um, so the multiverse is described as, sorry, I'm skipping a little bit because I'm a bit more long-winded than I expected to be. So the multiverse is described as, quote, an architecture of parallel worlds that house various interpretations and alternate histories of established characters. And this kind of echoes the way that fan fiction offers endless revisions and variations of the world presented in published media properties. While comic books and digital fan fiction are both networked forms of literature with many connections across the contemporary literary and media spheres, they have very different histories, materialities, and positions related to legality, commercial success, and legitimacy. So, to sum up, digital network fan fiction is a literature that can only exist in the age of the internet. Um, because it exists as many single texts that are hyperlinked in digital archives to form a concrete example of intertextuality. And in comic books, single issues make up part of a transmedia assemblage across comics and film adaptations, often organized into multiple different often organized into different multiverses. And the book also goes into romance novels, where each publication relies on a network of norms and expectations set by their genre as a whole, and epistolary fiction, which is partly or wholly comprised of smaller texts. So my work argues that all of these literatures are connected, and to understand one requires consideration of them all. The book does this by addressing a selection of these networked and notionally individual literary texts that relate to each other in many different ways. Networked fan fiction texts relate to the multiversal and transmedial comic books and films. Epistolary romance novels remediate the network communication possibilities of social media. And I look at some novels that seek within their limitations to convey the networked capabilities of fan fiction and comic books. So the chapters in my book move across a variety of network literatures and novels to tease out these tensions between node and network, between single and network text, and to explore what the repercussions might be for the concepts outlined above. The first two chapters establish the position of fan fiction in the digital literary sphere by looking at works of Captain America fan fiction and looking at what political potential there is in writing different versions of the world to those that we see in mainstream media. The next two chapters look at epistolary fiction and how they reflect anxieties around the use of digitally mediated communication in our lives and is reflected, in our understanding of ourselves and our relationships with others. And in those chapters, I look at more Captain America fan fiction and also the romance novel Attachments by Rainbow Rowell and the young adult novel Jenna/Finn by Hannah Moscovitz and Kat Helgeson. In the final chapter, I turn back to the novel to argue that it has the capacity to appropriate new forms of literature as they arise. And I discussed two specific examples, Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell and The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which both try to sort of capture something of the networked literature of fan fiction and comic books, respectively. So I just wanted to end with this little quote. I really like this line from Jorge Luis Borges, which I think really captures the sort of vibe of my work, and I hope if anything, that's what you're taking away from today. Quote, a book is not an isolated being, it is a relationship, an axis of innumerable relationships. So, in the context of digital culture in the early 21st century, these relationships span networks of humans and texts and technologies. These networks, I hope I've sort of made the case, resist being fully untangled, but I do hope that this book contributes to the conversation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've got some good questions for me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
That was great, Suzanne. Thank you so much for that really illuminating and cool presentation. Um, yeah, I'm excited to talk about this book. I want to remind everyone who is here that if you do have a question for Suzanne, just put it in the chat here and we're going to ask her live. Whenever something comes to you, we're going to start by going through some questions now. And thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. So, yeah, I wanted to start off by asking you if you could tell me a little bit about why you chose, the text that you chose. I know that you're kind of pulling from a wide range, like fan fiction, epistolary, romance novel, and comic books. But is there a particular reason why the text that made this book were chosen?
That's a super good question. Um, yeah, serendipity, definitely. Reading something and realized it fit into what I wanted to talk about. Many hours spent reading Captain America fan fiction and realizing that there were some really interesting things going on and some trends across multiple fan fiction texts that I thought deserved some critical attention. And I've always tried to sort of balance reading fan fiction and genre fiction and literary fiction across as many genres as possible. I have to admit, I'm less well read in some gritty crime fiction. I'm far less well read in, so there are no gritty crime fiction novels in this. Um, but just trying to draw from across all of my reading in a way that I could put them together without getting siloed by just focusing on one particular type of fiction. And I think that's the sort of main sort of methodological, not innovation, because I'm not the first one to do this, but trying to talk across published fiction and fan fiction in a way that treats them both as serious contributors to the digital literary sphere.
Could you talk a little bit about maybe where we're at in fan studies, which is like, kind of rapidly evolving like fan fiction, and maybe a little bit about what you'd like to see more of in fan studies scholarship?
Another excellent but huge question. Yeah, so for those who are not fan studies scholars, we kind of point to 1992 as being the year that it started in earnest. There were four publications that were kind of foundational to fan studies in that year, and it's grown ever since. I think the interesting thing is that there are no fan studies departments. There was a professor of fan studies in the UK. There is no longer. I think, my information might be out of date, but as far as I'm aware, at DePaul University, you could do a minor in fan studies, but not a major. So it's not institutionalized, which sounds like a bad thing because no one's supporting it, but also people are coming at it from their own institution. So people are on their own discipline. So people are coming at it from literary studies, marketing, psychology, media studies, cultural studies, transcultural studies, queer theory, feminist theory. Um, and that brings a lot of interesting strength to the discipline because everyone has their own ideas of how to proceed, but also lots of really interesting conversations when we come into not conflict, but we have different ways of approaching things. I would love to see maybe a couple of fan studies departments pop up around the world, so to give it a bit more legitimacy. It's also a very young discipline, even though I said 1992. So many people who are doing fan studies are at the undergraduate, postgraduate level. There are very few like professors, assistant professors, lecturers. So it would be nice to see a few more people in senior positions just to help the field out a bit. But I think there's just so much esoteric work going on in different pockets. We all get together once a year in October at the Fan Studies Network North America conference, which is online and very cheap. And I highly recommend it to anyone, even if you're not a fan studies scholar. So it's a good way to see the like absolutely wide range of things people are doing from their different perspectives.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. I know that was a big question. Um, we've got a great question here from Colleen in the chat. Thank you, Colleen, for uh, tuning in and also chiming in. Before I get to that, I do have one more fan studies question for you, if you don't mind,
Sure.
which is maybe also a big question, but um, I'm just curious for those who are interested in fan studies. Um, is there kind of one book that you would recommend besides your own as like a starting point?
Oh my goodness. You're asking the really tough questions today.
Sorry, okay,
Um,
we can also like put a pin on that and come back to it later.
I mean, so it's 1992, so we're 34 years past that. So to point to Textual Poachers by Henry Jenkins, which was one of the foundational books from 1992. It's definitely a good starting point, but there's been so much that's sort of written back to that since then. A huge favorite of mine is Rogue Archives by Abigail de Kosnik, which sort of it's one of these sneaky books, like so many fan studies things are, is that it doesn't say I'm a fan studies book, but it puts fan fiction and fan studies and remix culture like in a wider cultural context. And it was a huge inspiration. Uh, um, LSU Press published a wonderful book called Before Fan Fiction by Alexandra Edwards
Mhm.
a couple of years ago, which is very much more from the literary studies perspective. So a lot of histories or fan fiction will say that it started in 1920s and 30s in the letters pages of science fiction magazines, or that it started in the 1960s with people writing fan fiction and distributing it in zines about like Star Trek and Starsky and Hutch. But she finds fan practices in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I'd recommend that one too. I guess it just depends where you're coming from. If you want the literary side, the psychological side, the uh, sort of cultural studies side. So that's not really an answer, sorry.
No, that's a perfect answer. Thank you so much for indulging me. I'm going to get to this great question from Colleen, and I probably will have a follow-up question because I'm kind of thinking about the same thing too. So Colleen says, I had a question about the relationship between romance novels and fan fiction, as the two fields seem to be converging as publishers and authors draw on thick tropes and fandom structures for marketing, for example. Do you think romance novels becoming more digitally networked, even though they are still, as far as I know, predominantly physically published and sold?
Mm, great question, Colleen. Thank you. Um, you're right. The history of fan fiction and romance novels are inherently entangled. And it is becoming more visible at the moment with fan fiction stories being picked up by publishers and being published either sort of with an awareness that that they had an origin in fan fiction, or sometimes just with all the Manacled by Sen Lin Yu would be an example of that. Or sometimes where they sort of change the names, but then it's kind of an open secret that they originated in fan fiction. So I'm thinking of like The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. Heated Rivalry is another interesting one because the Game Changers series of novels by Rachel Reed, the first one or two, I think, were published as fan fiction, or not published, but were shared as fan fiction first. And there's some sort of, uh, it's not very clear whether they were fanfic first or meant to be published novels first. Um, it, hmm, yeah. So there was part of that question about whether contemporary novels are becoming more digitally networked. Um, hmm. So I think digital only romance novels, the kind that you get on sort of like published only on Amazon Kindle, and they're often by authors writing multiple works in the same series, I think you could make the argument, but that they are a digitally networked form of literature. Um, my book is kind of about how there's not the distinction between a single physical book on the shelf and network literature existing in digital realm is not completely clear cut, and there are definitely like crossovers between them. So I'm hesitant to say that one is fully networked and one is fully not. Yeah, sorry, that doesn't answer your question, but I need to think about that a little bit more. I think people often don't take fan studies terribly seriously, but they often don't take romance seriously. And I think there need to be a lot more scholars working in this field. So, Colleen, if you feel like taking up the baton, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question too, and I was thinking about that trio of Harry Potter fan fictions that were sold as novels last year. And Sen Yu was one of the authors. There was also Chains by Julie Soto and The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, that book
Mm.
by Bridget Knightley, which was originally a Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy fanfic. And I don't know how it works, right? I don't know if it's like, every time it's like let's just kind of erase, let's kind of blur the characters and the locations and make it a little generic, even though it's like a wink wink thing. But I do, so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. But I do want to ask you if you think that this trend of sort of traditional publishing either like elevates fan fiction as a form or sort of moves away from it. Does that make sense? Because there's just a lot going on, and I can't really tell if we're like kind of, almost like codifying fan fiction or if we're kind of moving away from it.
Yeah, another good question. I'm going to do the academic thing of saying it's a little bit of all of those, really. So you first kind of asked about the sort of process of publishing fan fiction and whether it's sort of made obvious and overt or it's like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. There's really a spectrum. Like some of them are not hiding it at all. Some of them, there's definitely romance novels that I've read that haven't said they're anything to do with fan fiction, but I kind of get the feeling that they might be. Fan fiction's been around for so many decades that like many like popular writers now started in fan fiction, but they may or may not talk about that. So Rainbow Rowell, who a couple of books of hers I talk about in my book, and she writes comics as well. She definitely used to write fan fiction, um, and you kind of feel like you can see that in the way that she writes her characters. But I think the sort of interesting thing there is that the mechanism of, so this goes to the second part of your question, like the mechanism of taking existing characters and twisting them and changing them and altering maybe them or their world and publishing it is very much exactly what fan fiction does. But it's also got a precedence in existing fiction. So in I mean, if we go back to like classical fiction and the oral classical literature and the oral tradition of Homer, people are just taking these same like elements and characters and bits of stories and myth and gods and demigods and remixing them in different ways. Just because it exists outside of the copyright system, it's not a problem. And then if you take bits of Shakespeare and remix them now, because it's outside of the copyright system, you can totally do that and you can be upfront about it. And there are many like prestigious literary works that do that. But then there are other works that like there's a tradition of postmodern rewrites of um, established classic novels that again are outside the copyright system by now. So things like when Sherlock Holmes originally came out of copyright, there were tons of parodies of him in like every genre. There's um, like Sherlock Holmes meets Freud, meets Frankenstein, meets Dracula. It's really fun. Um, so this is not anything new that fan fiction's doing. I think you're right, the visibility and the sort of closeness in the recent 10, 20 years since 50 Shades of Grey with the publishing industry is something a little bit that's bringing more visibility to it, which I just think is super interesting to look at how fan fiction makes us reflect on existing publishing, especially publishing books that are sort of adaptations, and how those make us reflect back on fan fiction. Like as I say, as I try to get across, they're not they're all related in some way.
No, that's fascinating, and you make a great point. And I'm thinking now about like the that kind of string of '90s teen movies that were kind of based off of Shakespeare plays for some
Hmm.
reason. I don't know why that's coming to mind, but it's an example of a, you know.
Yeah.
I've got three questions on deck for you, Suzanne, which is to say that if you have something that you'd like to ask, now's a good time to put it in the chat because we're kind of nearing the tail end. And so if I see it, I'll ask it. Yeah, so I guess was wondering if you could tell me, um, I'm sure there's a lot, but what's one major takeaway that you'd like readers to leave your book with?
Hmm. I'll try and be brief since you said we're close to wrapping up. Um, One major takeaway would be that I think I've already said it, that all types of literature participate in our cultural um, media sphere. It's a bit of a weird word, media sphere, but I think it's like a good one. So omitting any of them leaves you with like blind spots to other things. So not understanding romance, not understanding fan fiction, not understanding comics, not understanding literary fiction, not understanding Shakespeare, not understanding Homer kind of leaves you thinking that things are new and different when they're perhaps more related to something that already exists.
I see we got a special appearance from, was that Loki? Is that
Oh, my cat, yeah.
I was hoping so. So I'm really happy that we got that in here. I do want to talk a little bit. I want to talk just maybe one more question about trends, and this is sort of open ended, but I'm just curious if you're kind of noticing any trends right now in, digital fan fiction or epistolary fiction. Or are there any new novels that have come out recently that might fall under the umbrella of what you cover in the book? And I guess Heated Rivalry you did mention, but I'm not sure how new that is.
Yeah, no, Heated Rivalry is fascinating. I wasn't aware of it until the TV show, and then was persuaded to watch it, and then I read two of the novels it was based on. And I think they're perfectly good romance novels, but I've definitely read equally good romance novels out there. I've definitely read equally good and better fan fiction out there. I'm not saying they're not good. It's just interesting that they're the ones that have got this sort of global mega stardom, and I think the TV adaptation was a huge part of that. It was just a really good adaptation of a romance novel that seemed to understand the form and didn't try to make it something it wasn't. I think the creators really sort of respected its origins. And I haven't seen that very often. I know people really like the Bridgerton series. I haven't seen that. Maybe that's as good. Um, Trends in fan fiction, I absolutely cannot comment, I'm afraid. So on Archive of Our Own, which is only one fan fiction website, there are over 15 million works. So even if I read all day, every day, I'm never going to like grasp like 1% of those. So I think it would be unfair of me to try and generalize about them. Also, I read very specifically in English related to specific TV and film shows, books that I've read already. So there are huge swathes of fan fiction I'm not intimate with and not qualified to talk about. Like K-pop and K-dramas and like Japanese dramas, Chinese dramas, Thai dramas are like a massive, massive uh, media phenomenon, and all the fan fiction that goes with that is super interesting. Luckily, other people are taking up the fan studies baton and doing the work in that. So I'm sorry to be a cop out, but I can't talk about trends only in my like very specific little bit of the internet.
Yeah, I just I think that's a good place to kind of stop at. I do want to thank you again for your wonderful answers and for your time, and I want to thank everyone one more time for tuning in and spending your afternoon or evening with us, depending on where you're tuning in from. I would like to leave this conversation by simply asking you what you're working on now, what's coming next, if you have anything in the works.
Sure, yeah. So no one will employ me to do fan studies, which is which is just the way it is. But I've got a couple of research projects that I'm working on when I find the time. One is looking at the sort of also at the connections between fan fiction and the digital literary sphere, but more in the sort of publishing angle. So I have a data set of reviews from the website Goodreads of people reviewing fan fiction because Goodreads does allow you to put fan fiction on the site and review it as if it's a book, which a lot of fan fiction writers are not happy with because they want to stay in their own fan fiction ecosystem. So I have a project at the moment that I really need to finish looking at that. So kind of similar themes, but taking different materials and a different approach because I'm using some sort of data-led methods and computational methods.
That sounds utterly fascinating, especially kind of in an era where reviews have maybe more power than ever to like make or break a book. So very much looking forward to that.
Thank
That's
you.
all we have for today. Anything before we go, Suzanne, that you'd like to say to those tuning in?
Just a huge thank you for you all for coming and listening to me chat about my book. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Until next time.